Welcome back, students, to the Humanities 232 course. We're going to pick it up right where we left off last time in Chapter 14. This is Painting in the Netherlands that we'll move to this time. And in this, the one of the more interesting artists that we'll look at is Hieronymus Bosch. He had a pessimistic view of human nature, really epitomized human folly and the inevitable punishment for sin. So, again, a very pessimistic view of humanity. We see this in his Garden of Earthly Delights. We can see the pleasures of the body that supposedly lead to damnation or lead one to hell. And it has a lot of private and complex symbolism in this painting. Now you'll notice this is a three-paneled painting, sometimes referred to as some would say a triptych, though usually in a triptych these would be hinged wings that would open up on the painting. So I don't think these necessarily have that, but we do want to look at this. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a depiction of paradise, of heaven. Here on the right, damnation, hell, and then here in the middle, the life on earth where people are giving in to their bodily desires. And again, even though part of that is supposed to be about sex, it's really depicted in a very symbolic, very bizarre way. You can see that as we zoom in here on the depiction of hell, even though the people are obviously supposed to be in torment here. There's creatures that don't even exist. Really, the fabrication of a very interesting mind of this individual, and so he's more than worth checking out more in detail in your text. Again, in Painting in the Netherlands, we see individuals like Peter Bruegel, the elder. Once again, pessimistic view, the futility of human existence, the pervasiveness of sin, order and purpose in natural cycles, however, both in the weather and in the human cycle of life. We see that in his Triumph of Death and his Hunters in the Snow, two things that we'll look very briefly at here, and scenes from peasant life. And he tends to, interestingly, depict the common person, the peasant, in a very noble fashion. Here's the Triumph of Death, depicting some of the things that happen in war and in plagues. And again, it's obvious that you see the very pessimistic view of things. As opposed to the snow hunters here, you see them coming back with the dogs. There's the people in the village that are still working to eke out a living. So it's not an easy existence, but there's a certain nobility to it in terms of the way that he depicts it. We'll now go quickly to art and architecture in France. We see individuals like Jean Clouet in his depiction of Francis I. We get good examples of his work. There's a real combination of French Gothic and Italian Renaissance in both the art and the architecture. We see this in the Chateau de Chambord, which we'll look at here shortly. There's a real emphasis on decoration. And we also see this in the square court of the Louvre. The Louvre being one of the most famous museums of all time. It's still standing even to this day. Here is the chateau that we talked about. Chateau is another word for house, or in some cases like this, palace. This is real emblematic of the Renaissance man, the Renaissance person. To be able to accomplish these great things, it takes grandeur. And so you see the type of staff that it would take to be able to maintain a structure such as this. So this is obviously here for royalty, or at the very least, very rich individuals. And so beautiful there in the reflection of the water. And it's just, again, very emblematic of the Renaissance man or the Renaissance person. We're now going to go to art in Elizabethan England, Elizabethan referring to Queen Elizabeth I. At this point in England, for the first time, we see a real stability and prosperity here. They have good relations with the Netherlands and Spain, and so this opens up opportunities for trade and again makes them a much more prosperous nation. We do, however, though, see a certain insularity with their concept of nationalism and their almost obsession with that. We see this more and more in these nations as opposed to previous times when it was more of an empire. Now it's individual nations, and we'll see this in the works of Hans Holbein the Younger and also in Nicholas Hilliard. Here is Hans Holbein's depiction of Henry VIII. Once again, this is the way a ruler wants to be depicted at this time. He's very large, but this just means he's got enough money for food. And so this was not considered a negative back then. As a matter of fact, it was considered very much a positive. We see it also here in the depiction of one of Henry VIII's wives, and then finally in the depiction of Queen Elizabeth herself. Interesting that they would depict the strange creature here, almost looks like a rat. And then the clothing is obviously something that we wouldn't wear today. Their concept of style, as in any time, is much different from ours. The very white face that they would emphasize with the white makeup and things of this nature. Now I want to go to the music of the Northern Renaissance. There's a real complexity of style, polyphony. If you listen to this music that's within the topic here in your Schoology material, polyphony, many polyphony sounds, phonics, and so we see these various melodies here that are flowing throughout the piece, more than one melody, but they complement each other. And so we see it in musical compositions such as the motets in the church and the madrigals for outside the church. We see instrumental accompaniment for not the first time in history, but certainly much more common because you'll recall in earlier times, music in the church was strictly a cappella or unaccompanied. We see it in the French songs, the what they would call the chansons, the lyrical narratives, the German and Flemish songs with the Roman military and political themes. And so in composers such as Isaac and Sindel, this is very evident. We also see it in the legacy of one of the most famous musicians of the time and composers, John Dunstable. He's known for the Italian secular music of the day, also the English litany that comes along later in the simplified Gregorian chant. You'll recall that the Gregorian chant originated back in medieval times, and they're bringing some of this back because the pendulum tends to swing between complex and simplified music. We also see it in the Book of Common Prayer, in it being notated here, and of course we're saying this in English rather than in the what you see here before you, and in the Catholic music traditions that use blocks of chords and counterpoint being the way even modern day hymns are written with soprano, alto, tenor, bass in these various parts. We'll also see it in the English anthems and in the works of Thomas Tallis. Uh, does many compositions for not only for Protestant churches but for Catholic masses. Again, they're writing things for whoever's going to pay them, and he's said to be the master of this counterpoint that we just mentioned. William Byrd is another significant figure in both, once again, Catholic compositions and the Catholic masses. Masses, of course, being the Catholic Church church service, and in the virginal instrumentation and the madrigals. Now, don't let this word fool you here, virginal. This is not a reference to an unmarried woman here. This is a reference to a particular keyboard instrument, one of the forerunners of the piano during the day. We've mentioned madrigals already. These are expressions of emotional extremes. They're still very popular even today, some of the most challenging vocal music ever written, and so vocal groups love performing these. Composers such as Thomas Morley, Thomas Weeks are very, very active in this area, as well as is John Dowland in his airs and songs, simple songs with lute accompaniment, the lute being a simplified version of the flute, and some string instruments are involved as well. These tend to be obsessively depressed and woeful. You might wonder, well, then why did they write them? Well, they're trying to evoke certain types of human emotions here. We'll go now to English literature, and we'll conclude with this subject. Humanism in England is very strong at this time. Um, Caxton's printing press. There's much in the way of historical debate, even to this day, whether it was Caxton that was most responsible for the printing press, or was it Gutenberg, as originally thought. Regardless of who it was, this results in increased literacy. There's more of a need to read because access to books, because of the printing press now, is going to be more accessible. And so there's more education now for this. They're using classical and Italian models here for their literature. And so we see this in the writings of people like Thomas More, Sir Philip Sidney, and finally Edmund Spenser as well. This also results in the growth of English drama. They're writing these dramatic presentations that are to be performed by actors. And so, for the second time in history, we see drama flowing out of, or originating out of, actually things that went on in the church service. Back in ancient Greek times, it comes out of their religious service. And then in a more modern period of history, such as this, it comes out as a result of people acting out the Lord's Supper in church services, and drama grows out of that. It's inspired by these classical models, and the reason why it becomes more and more popular and can be supported by people is that there's an increasing prosperity, and of course that brings leisure time to people. They want something to do. Well, let's go see a play. Let's go see a drama. And so you have these traveling actors that are supported by patrons in the nobility that have the money to support it. They'll bring them in to perform. They'll travel anywhere they can find an audience. But eventually, what happens, especially in the time of some of these later dramatists, writers that we'll see, you actually have permanent theaters that they can perform. And so this is revolutionary because now these actors can actually settle down, live in a particular town, and these writers can kind of settle in because there's these permanent theater buildings where people can come now on a regular basis. There's a real intellectual content to this drama, but also an emphasis on the common touch, appealing to the common person. So whereas they're trying to appeal to the noble class, the people with the money, because you want somebody to fund it, there's also this appeal to the groundlings, the more common people out there, so that you can get these larger audiences. And then finally, we see two of the giants of the time that this culminates in their particular writings: Christopher Marlowe, using blank verse and his themes of humanity defeated by destiny. Again, a little pessimistic there. And then finally, the most famous of all, William Shakespeare. Everyone's heard of Shakespeare, regardless of your background. Shakespeare used classical models, but he made it much more interesting with these very complicated plots. And so that's why people, millions of people, even to this day, go to see Shakespeare performed. His plays still hold up even to this day. His use of soliloquy is very interesting. This is this idea of having an aside to the audience that only the audience is supposed to hear, as opposed to anybody on stage, or even the fact that maybe everybody is off stage at this point. If you ever notice a TV show called House of Cards that's available on Netflix right now, you'll notice that the main character, the one that portrays the president later on, has these frequent asides where he just looks at the camera and talks to you viewing the show, but no one on the show can hear him. And so it's really interesting the way you get insight into the character there. It's also interesting the way Shakespeare deals with what makes people behave the way they do in terms of their psychological motivation. And even though the science of psychology has not even begun to be explored at this time, he's advanced enough to where he's already doing that in terms of his art there of writing these plays. He's also dealing with some of the biggest themes and most important topics that one could consider, such as the great problems of human existence. And so his plays, as well as some of these other dramatists, are intended to go very deep in terms of probing what it means to be a human being and the great problems of, as we state here, of human existence. And that wraps up part two. We'll see you next time for additional material here in Humanities 232.